UCB Life Issues with Paul Hammond.
And as always, a very warm welcome to this week's Life Issues. Now, I have to confess, I found it more than a little disconcerting when I started to hear my dad speak out of my mouth. And not just in phrases I use either. It seems as though the older I get, the more I heard his humour, the more I heard his thought patterns, and even the more I heard his groans when I stand up or bend over to pick something up. But the time it got really scary was when I heard my sons start to echo me. They say like father, like son, don't they? And for the majority, the fact that we sow into the next generation is probably a good thing. But what if dad isn't a good example? What if dad has his own issues, his own behaviour problems, even his own addictions? Does that have to manifest in the next generation? Or can the cycle be broken? Can the circle be cut? Can a new branch be grown from the family tree? And what about the impact of absentee dads? How do we help the sons become the men they should be, rather than rinsing and repeating the same mistakes generation after generation? And in the light of the fact that we have the father image of God, how do we help those let down by their dad to build a true and meaningful connection with our Father? Especially as the "who art in heaven" bit can, if we're not careful, suggest another absentee dad. Well, my guests to reflect on what dads can be, how they can leave a legacy in today, especially their sons, and what the rest of us need to know about the headspace of those who struggle with the idea of dad, is the author of a book called No Hope to Full of Joy. It's available online. It's been written by James Goldie. And James, welcome to Life Issues.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Let's start by talking about your dad then, because we are looking at, well, we're looking at the east coast of Scotland. You grew up there. What was the situation with your dad at home?
Well, I don't really have a lot of memories from early childhood. I would love to say that I could look back with great fondness, but this wasn't always the case. I remember a lot of my childhood would be spent at grandparents'. I would stay a lot at my dad's parents on a Friday night. They lived in the same town as us. It was a small town in West Lothian, and we would go there, and I would go there anyway and stay there on a Friday night. And for years, I think I lived in complete ignorance as to why I would be spending a lot of time down there. But it became really evident to me around about when I was about 7 or 8. And the reason probably why was it was to protect me from the abuse that was going on in the house. It was evident in my childhood, and to protect me, I think, from any harm. I would spend time down there with cousins and sort of kind of in complete ignorance, but bliss as well, of ignorance of what was going on at home, but then bliss of, the joy of being at my cousin's house.
And the situation that was going on at home was that your dad was often, because of an addiction to drink, was violently abusing your mum. At what age did you start to become aware of what was happening?
As I say, probably about around 7 or 8. And I think that was when my brother was born when I was 8. So he's my younger brother, obviously. And he was born, and I think I then adopted a different role. I knew that things were different. I mean, I was going to school and seeing different parents maybe leaving their children off at school. I was often just left to kind of wander on my own. I remember, like, even at 5, 6 years old, I would sort of kind of wander up the main street in my hometown, go to school, and then come back down, and often have to wait outside and my mother coming back or whatever. And different things like that. But obviously there was things going on at the house. But at that very young age, I didn't really know that much about it. So when I was about 8, as I say, my brother was born. He was brought home, and from then on, I think I adopted a different role in the house. I became almost like a protector to him. I knew that there was violence going on down the stairs. I knew that there was aggression. There was even at that young age, there was a terror and a fear building up inside my very young body.
And you talk about how you, in the book, you talk about how you would try to protect him from it by assuring him everything was all right and there was no need to worry and everything was going to be okay, until eventually you went down the stairs and you saw the reality of what was going on and you saw what your dad was doing. What do you think drove him into those behaviour patterns? I mean, how much was it that it was something that started with him rather than the influence of previous generations?
I think he was probably masking some sort of trauma from his own childhood, perhaps, or something like that. But the violence and the aggression would only really come whenever he was drinking. So, I mean, all those other times when he wasn't drinking, he was never at the house. He was working. So he was a worker. He would work he was a joiner, so he would be away and he would be working. He'd sometimes do a wee thing in Scotland called a homer, where he would work then late at night and do an extra bit of work or something like that, just for extra pennies. He would bring them home, but obviously he would then just be missing for hours and then come home late at night. And I have this distinct memory of stale alcohol and wood chip smell and cigarettes, kind of all those different kind of things mixed together. And I have that memory, and whenever I smell anything distinctly like that or remotely like that, then it kind of takes me back to that moment of being that child again. But in relation to my father, I think that he was a lost soul. He was a completely lost soul. I think he was hurting. I think there was something that obviously had happened in his own childhood or teenage years or something, a trauma-based incident, something that made him the person that he was. And that was elevated then by him taking alcohol and then becoming this like almost Jekyll and Hyde character, taking on aggression. And I think my mother was probably, it pains me to say it, but probably too fearful or too innocent or too scared to do anything about it. And at the end of the day, she loved him. She married him. She
well,
bore children.
You say that in the book, that she was actually blinded by her love for him until that moment where you walked down the stairs and found them and found her on the receiving end of his violence. And she moved you out. I mean, the way I'm reading it, she moved you out virtually that night and left him a letter telling him that this was the case. And you talk about how he reacted to that. And I think it's maybe important we just dwell on that, because whilst in some ways your dad was fulfilling the sort of cultural stereotype of the time of many Scottish working class men, whether those stereotypes were accurate or not, that was the imagery that seems to surround him. The complexity of his addiction and the cycle of abuse and the way in which her taking the two of you and moving out, as he said, broke his heart. I mean, it's not a straightforward black and white shallow thing, addiction, is it?
It's not. No, it's very complex. It's deeply complex, actually, and to the point where you make reference there in the book, and it is true. I go down late one night. I'm about 13 years old. This has been going on for 5 years. I've been protecting my brother in there for 5 years, covering his ears and reassuring him things are going to be okay and stuff like this. And going down the stairs one night and being spoken to by my father. Oh, here's the big man coming. Here's the big man coming. What's he going to do? And and I don't know what happened during that point. But and you say there about my mother as well, and I think that possibly that was the catalyst for her to leave, and that was the point where she kind of realised that this is not only affecting her, it's affecting her children, and it's it's not a good relationship to be in, and possibly that was the point where she had made her decision, and it was the next day that we had left that home, and when I spoke to my father later on in years, we talked about that time. We talked about the letter that was left for him. We talked about the fact that he had came home from work that evening, and there was absolutely no memories left of us in that home. And he told me that it had broken his heart. And I remember reflecting on that at that time and thinking, because I was just very early in my recovery at that point, that thinking that but you had no heart. I only saw evil or a bad man at that time, because I was so young and I never saw that anybody could have any good in them. And yeah, so it was difficult for me at that time, even at that time, to kind of reflect back and go, how could you have been brokenhearted? You did what you did. And even at that point, he apologized to myself, and I think he had apologized to my brother at this point. But I still couldn't get over that point there, that he had done harm, he had done bad, and I couldn't see any good in that circumstance.
And you allude there to your own experience and the fact that you had that conversation where you yourself were early on in recovery. They do say, like father, like son, don't they? Tell us about you then. What did that environment sow into you and produce in you through your teenage years and into your early 20s?
Well, I mean, from 12, I was, I mean, even up to about 12 years old. Like I've said there, I've alluded to the fact that I would walk to school on my own. I was pretty much left alone to my own devices. Would come home from school, nobody would be at the house, and I wasn't even allowed in the house. I'd be waiting out the back on people coming back. My mother coming back from wherever she was. So I pretty much was just left to kind of roam the streets from a young age. So from around about the age of 12, I started kind of running around in different gangs. I would run about in a small gang just across the road from me in a big, massive park. We would go and meet there. I saw my dad as this a scary person. I saw him as this person that I could not imagine emulating. I couldn't imagine being like. But so quickly, it happened so quickly that it just snowballed, and I became like him overnight. So from about the age of 12, I would go over to this park. We would sniff solvents. We would run about. We would kick a ball about and do what children do at that time. But also then we would go looking for different scraps everywhere, fights all over the town, into different towns. We would run about and just cause havoc. We were becoming known to the police. We were being labelled as antisocial.
And drink and drugs were fueling that. But also there was in you, you say, a level of recklessness and a level of violence that actually kind of emulated the reputation, or a bit of the reputation, that your dad had. You talk about going into a pub with him and people either, they didn't want to cross him, they didn't want to upset him, and so on. And yet it seems that in that time, you were actually drawn to him and drawn to the time, despite everything that had happened. Why was that?
It's difficult to say, but I yearned for a father figure. And even though he was, I have to say that my dad was my dad. He was the scariest man alive, yet I idolized him. I was drawn to him. He wasn't very tall. He was an amateur boxer. He was well known in the town. There were elements of his life that were attractive because he was an attractive man. And it was difficult not to be drawn to his charisma, even though that whenever he was drinking, he would become so aggressive to the point that you couldn't even talk to him, because he would think that you were acting smart or something like this, and it would then. That was when we started going out later on, when I was about 16, 17 years old, before I then just went off the track. But we would go out, and I would be so fearful to kind of cross him that that I would just not speak. But at the same time, to be in his presence was absolutely wonderful, because I think I was absolutely just completely drawn to him, but completely missing that element of a father.
And do you think that yearning shaped your behaviour? Because I'm not for a moment suggesting that you consciously emulated his pattern of living or the characteristics of his life, but do you think that there was a driver in you that was going, if I'm like him, or was it just something more fundamental than that?
I think so. I think yes, because there were times when he was a very humorous man as well, I have to say. And people do say I was at my grand's, I was at his funeral, with my gran, who's his mum, and we were in the hearse going to the funeral service, and we were in the back of the car, and it was completely somber mood, and I lightened the mood perhaps, and started singing some songs, and we started messing about, and my granny said, that's exactly what your dad would have done in this same circumstance. He had this, as I said before, he had this charisma. He was quite a funny guy. Well, he thought he was funny. I was probably funnier. But whenever we were together, we would have this kind of, to and fro about humour, and it was quite good to see. But at the same time, whenever he was drinking, it was not approachable. And I think that at that point, I saw that perhaps maybe he was humorous all the time whenever he was drinking, or maybe what this kind of stuff. That became quite attractive to me. But at the same time, whenever I think I drank because I was lonely. I was lonely, and I was drinking with friends who were over the park. We would drink maybe some cider or anything like that, when we were very young. And it was more a social thing in the beginning. And then it became, I would maybe then, we would move from alcohol to maybe sniffing some petrol or whatever it may be. And then it would move on to maybe cannabis. And then it moved on then eventually to the recreational drugs, which then became my hook,
And by the time you got to 17, you were homeless. You had effectively burnt your bridges. You were out on your own, and in some ways, you had exceeded the sort of spiral of life that your dad had fallen down. And you say in the book that you, at no point did you see that it was your fault. So, who? Back then, I know it's very different now. I know your perspective through recovery has taught you that it's very different now. But back then, who did you blame, or was blame an irrelevance?
I think at the beginning, I perhaps blamed my dad. Yes, 100%. I also probably blamed my mum as well for being, and this was at that time. It's not a feeling I have now, but I think that perhaps maybe I thought then that she was pretty weak. I thought that there was times when, and there was other family members as well that maybe could have done things. They could have maybe said something. Something could have maybe have been done, and maybe life would have been different. But I blamed all those different things for my circumstance at that time, and not only until and later on in life, I then obviously realised that it was my own selfishness, my own not dealing with any life issues, if you will, that drove me to that point of being street homeless at 17 years old.
And you talk about your selfishness in connection with you describe it as the serious dark side to addiction that people don't always realise, about how you would go to your mum's and you would basically stand in the street and yell at the house until she came out to give you what little money she had to get rid of you. And your brother being desperate to connect with you, and you actually, as your mum knew, wanting nothing to do with him, you were only interested in your addiction. That core selfishness that drives addiction is a thing that... How do you actually break through that if you are trying to work with someone who is addicted?
Well, I mean, it's difficult. I mean, it's the old saying, isn't it? You can take a horse to water, but never drink from it. I mean, we as people only want to see good in other people. We want to see people that are doing well, and perhaps we have a family member who's maybe struggling with addiction, and we have an idea of how we want to see that person's life in 5, 6, whatever years. But ultimately, it's down to the individual. So, for example, I would go back to my mother's house at 2 a.m. and cause a hassle outside, knowing fully that she only wanted good for me, but she would give me some money to get rid of me. But then she would maybe speak to me and go, "You need to sort yourself out here. You need to sort yourself out. You need to do this and you need to do that." And it was almost, at that point, I was not listening at all. I wasn't listening to anything that anybody would say. Now, I wasn't just getting it from my mother. I was getting it from other family members. I was getting it from cousins. I was getting it from, family, friends of family, that would say that, that your dad is this, he's very upset knowing that you're like this now. And it was difficult at that point to hear that as well. But at the same time, I wasn't doing anything about it. I didn't want to do anything about it because I had no sense of, I want to say morality here, but I had no sense of, I didn't care who I hurt at that point. And I think that for me to change, I had to hit real rock bottom. I remember getting caught stealing from my granny's house, who had only good for me. I mean, I would go down to, I often make reference, I make references in the book as well. I would go down to my granny's, my granny and my grandfather, they were my dad's mum and dad, taught me a lot about not only just cooking and different things like this, because my granddad he was a bit of a chef, stuff like this, but they taught me a lot. They taught me a lot about humanity and different things like this. But I think the low point for me was that I was caught stealing from their house. I had broken into their house. They used to leave a key out the back. And I went into the back of the house, in the back door, went up the stairs, went to my granny's dressing table, whatever, and took items of jewellery to sell on to feed my habit. I then was walking out the house and my granddad was actually in the living room. And I'd walk right by him, hadn't even seen him. I was that blinded by my addiction. I was that blinded by that drive to take those items. I can't even mind how much I got for them, but they weren't worth that much. But I was that blinded by that drive to take those items and go and sell them that I had walked right past my grandfather without even seeing him. I walked out the door. I put the key in back where it had been hiding before. And I was about to walk out the gate. My granddad caught me at the gate. And he gave me an ultimatum. And he had said that, look, if you leave the rings, you can continue to come back down. We'll support you. We'll do whatever we can to help you. But if you take the rings, you can forget about coming back. And I say this uh, in my book, that it was the last time I ever saw my granda,
Aye.
and it hurt me so much, but at the same time, it didn't even tickle the outsides. It wasn't until later on in life, obviously, I look back on that. I look back on that in recovery. I saw that how much angst and worry and pain and all that kind of stuff that I'd caused all those people that loved me, and I couldn't see it because I was blinded by my own addiction, and that's what I would say, that whenever we're caught in addiction, we're blinded by it. We're drawn to, if it's heroin, if it's alcohol, if it's sex or it's gambling or whatever it may be, the we're blinded by the need to get that item, whatever it may be, that can then blind something else. So it'll be a trauma, it'll be a past hurt, it'll be something, because we get addiction so wrong. Addiction is not just simply just about heroin. It's not just simply about cocaine. Those are the attributes of addiction. So those are the things that we use to escape. Those are the things that we use to kind of deal with the past trauma that we have. And if we deal with the past trauma, then the addictions become much easier to deal with, in my opinion. But we try and attack addiction by just, you need to stop drinking. You need to stop doing this. Once you stop doing that, you then revert back to that time when you were dealing with that trauma and you were drinking to deal with that trauma. Do you see where I'm coming from here? And it's difficult to then deal with. So my mother saying to me for countless years, you need to stop drinking, was useless advice. But she was doing it because she loved me.
Yeah.
And she was doing it because she wanted to see only good for me. She wanted to see me stopping drinking because she saw the damage it was doing, but didn't know that the damage was already there. And I was only drinking because I was trying to, sticky plaster that trauma.
In a sense, the drinking and the addiction was a veil that you were using to cover the trauma rather than having to look at the trauma. And you do talk about how throughout your life with, I think there were a couple of fellas, Stevie and Drew, who were football coaches when you were interested in football as a teenager, how the discipline and the maturity of their lives was attractive to you. You were drawn to that. But you then got the opportunity to actually find a way to discover that in yourself when you ended up in Leith, because despite what the Proclaimers song says, it wasn't a very sunny place when you were there, and the reality of it was that in the heart of what sounds like a terrible environment for somebody trying to deal with addiction, because they were surrounded by drugs and alcohol and addiction and crime and so on, there was this glimmer of light. There was this candle in the middle of the storm, it seems, of the Bethany Christian Centre. When you started down that road, had you any concept that you could escape the echo of your dad's life and behaviour?
In short, no. In 1998, that's when I ended up there. I was a broken man with no hope. I was wandering the streets of Edinburgh as I was street homeless. I would eventually find a homeless hostel. This hostel was firstly Bethany House. It was run by Bethany Christian Trust. It's a Christian organisation that offers support to the homeless and the addicted in Scotland. I would move into their hostel. It was in Leith. As soon as I entered the hostel, I was completely overwhelmed with emotions that I suppose I had never really had before. For 10 years at that point, I suppose, and not 10 years, 22 years. My 22 years were chaotic, to say the least. They were the first 8, 9, 10, right up to the point where we left my father's house. Those were chaotic years, where there were so many different incidences, of trauma, of hearing things that I shouldn't have heard, and that would then obviously lead me on to then an addiction that would rob me of 9 years of my life, and then to then find myself in the middle of Leith, surrounded by all manners of different kind of vices, heroin, sex workers, all these different types of people. It would have been so easy for me just to carry on doing what I was doing. But there was something that was drawing me to this house, this hostel. They called it Bethany House. It was a massive hostel. And one thing that I do distinctly remember was walking in and being accepted for who I was. I then went to a room. They showed me a room. The room was clean. The bed was made. There was a hot meal down for me downstairs. There were people to talk with. Not just looking for something, but they wanted to actually talk to you. They wanted to find out what, why, who and where and why and when. All the different questions that nobody else would have asked you. I stayed there for a few months, and then through talking to one of the support workers, they recognised that I had an addiction, and they asked me, sorry, they didn't move me, but they asked me if I wanted to consider a move to their rehabilitation unit, which was, and you say that, and it's wonderful where it is, but it's completely strange. It's right in the middle of Leith. There's about 50 bars next door to it, and it's up. You walk down Leith Walk, and it's just completely just surrounded by alcohol, and there's people begging on the streets, and it's completely chaos. But then you walk round this corner on Castlebank Street, and you walk down to Bethany Christian Centre, and you walk in, and you're just complete. It's like a warm blanket. Can it been put around you?
When you look
and
back
it's so
on that,
strange.
When you look back on that and you see that, because I think this is important for us to identify, because in the book you identify crystal clear that the only reason you were able to find recovery in that environment that's surrounded by all those bars, the only reason you were able to find the direction, I mean, you do make the point that small things like a clean room or a change of clothes can be a catalyst to change, and it's important to remember that. Sort of treating the individual as an individual and as someone who is of value is important. But you do make the point that there was a spiritual dimension to that, the effectiveness of that oasis.
Absolutely. I mean, well, for number one, the workers there were all born again Christians. They were all born again Christians. And to be fair, I had never heard that word in my whole entire life. I mean, my father was a Catholic man, and my mum was a Protestant, but I was brought up neither. So that this was alien to me, almost, that somebody would be like, I didn't know I didn't know what it was. But I always remember I used to always find myself speaking with the cook, and one of the cooks, his name was Danny. He had been a drinker himself, but he was a saved man. And I remember him always telling me that, and I was going, "What are you even talking about? I don't know what you're talking about here, mate. I've no idea what you're on about." And so he would always talk to me. We'd go out the back, I'd have a cigarette or whatever. He'd always talk to me about Jesus. He would always talk to me about the need to be saved, the need to recognize that I'm a sinner, the need to be, and he would go to the point of being washed in the blood, and I would always go, "What are you on about here? That's just a bit too far for me, big man." But there was something about him, and I don't know whether it was the fact that he was a massive, scary individual looking, big skinhead on him, and lots of tattoos, but there was just something that drew me to him. Again, that almost like that father figure, and I would chat to him every single day, and he would then explain to me what it would be like to be saved, what it would like to be, that I had a need. and that need was to be saved. And I remember that it was about maybe 2-3 months into staying there, continually going down and speaking to him day after day, and to the point where I think I got angry with him when I said, "What do I do? What are you talking about?" And almost to the point where, I had recognised that I do need something in my life. I had a massive hole in my heart. I had a massive hole right here in the middle of my body that needed filled. And I recognized that, but I would continually try to fill it with alcohol and drugs and different things and sex and all these different stuff that only last for like a short time. And he said, you need to be a believer. You need to come to the Lord Jesus, and you need to accept his grace. You need to accept his mercy, and you need to simply pray this prayer. And I said, just say this prayer. Lord Jesus, I'm sorry for all the bad things I've done and will do. And I recognize that I'm a sinner and I can't live this life on my own. I believe that you are the Son of God and that you died and rose again. Come into my heart and be my Saviour. Amen. And I prayed this prayer out loud with him. And at that point, I believed that I had been saved. But it was only the beginning.
And that's a really important point, because sometimes when we tell stories about redemption and so on, it's as though, and in that moment, everything became perfect. And life was a bed of roses. But actually, you're very honest in your book. I mean, you talk about how on Hogmanay and Millennium Year, how you were torn with the temptation to go out and to go back into the reality of what the celebrations that night in Edinburgh and be a part of that and fall off the wagon. You also talk about how when you met your wife, as she is now, Gillian, when you met her, you could not conceive that you would stand a chance with her because you were a worthless nobody and she was this wonderful woman. I wonder if that was also a part of that redemption moment. Did you actually believe that prayer was going to work for someone like you in the depths of where you were at that time?
I don't think so. No, because at that point I was seeking. I was definitely seeking, but I wasn't 100% believing at that point that a worthless creature like myself could receive number one, grace, and then two, forgiveness. I didn't believe that the things that I had done to that point, the people that I'd hurt, the places I had went to were just beyond comprehension. That a God, a Father, could forgive me for the things that had that preceded.
Was that as much about your image of Father as it was about your image of yourself?
I think so. Because I was deeply disturbed, shall we say, about believing that God was a father, that God was like a loving father. Because again, I had never received that in my own childhood or my life, really. I'd never really known the love of a father. I'd never really known. I knew I had a dad. I knew I had somebody who had, if you will, birthed me, and was happy enough just at that. I didn't have a father figure growing up who wanted to walk to school with me holding my hand. I didn't have a father figure in my youth who would pick me up after falling down and going, "Evan will be okay. You're grand here. Put a wee plaster on that and you're fine." So I didn't really understand the concept of God the Father, which made it difficult at that point, I think, for me to then fully commit to understanding what God was all about at that point.
How difficult was the journey that took you to that point?
It was very difficult. There were I had never cried, emotionally cried, probably ever, really. To be perfectly honest, I had never really dealt with any emotions that would then draw me to sit down and feel hurt. I was hurt, but I had learned to deal with that hurt by hurting other people. So then I became this almost empty vessel. And when I was saved, I then went off the rails a bit again. I went back into the world. I went back into rehab in 1999. And at that point, I fully surrendered my life to God. I have this imagery of I had a counsellor at that point, and she, it's quite difficult to say this over audio, but if you can imagine that I am holding out two hands, but one hand I have clenched and I'm holding on to my heart here. So I am going to God with open hands. And this is what the counsellor has said to me. She said, Goldie, you are going to God with open hands. Now, if you can imagine that I am now standing with one hand open, so I'm giving a bit, and I'm holding this thing here. And she said, that's what it was like when you first surrendered your life to Jesus. We just need to let this thing here go. And she
opened both hands.
Opened both hands, and she said, give God everything. Now, that thing that you were holding back there is the anger towards your dad. It's the anger towards your non-relationship with him. It's the anger towards that you thinking you're just going to turn out just like him. It's the no hope that you have for any sort of future. And she said, that's not what God has planned for you. God has plans for you. And she reminded me of Jeremiah 29, verse 11, that God has plans to prosper us, not to harm us, but to give us a hope and a future. And it wasn't immediate. It wasn't just straight away, but it was a difficult process. There were tears, but there was movement.
And how important, because there are two things in the book that I think are perhaps relevant in this, because you talk about how eventually you were able to knock on your dad's door and forgive him for what he had sown into your life in dealing with his own difficulties and his own struggles and masking his own difficulties and struggles. And you also talk about how you had, and I get a sense that it was not just a past thing, but it's maybe an ongoing thing, had to allow God to remind you that even though your own dad had been absent, he is never absent. He's always, to quote you, he's always loving, tender, compassionate, and ultimately merciful, a grace-giving Heavenly Father who never leaves us. How important were those two elements in that?
Well, I mean, moving back into the rehab, I completely surrendered my life to the Lord. And I realized that I owed my entire existence to him. Through counseling, I would then learn that my issues derived from my lack of a father. And I think that's the ultimate goal here today, is to recognize that there are people who are lacking a father figure in their life, or a parental figure. And my dad, through all his faults, he was lost himself. He was in need of a saviour. And he was a wretch as I was. And we all need that touch from Jesus. And as painful as this is, we sometimes see family members miss this opportunity. And it was a real stumbling block for me to see that God, the Father, is a loving Father who has my interests at heart. He only wanted good for me. And I struggled greatly with that, to be honest. And I admit that it took me an age to come to the realization that God the Father wanted and wants a relationship with us. He wanted a relationship with me, a broken man with no hope at that time, and no future, and no desire to have a daddy in my life. I realised that through spending time with God, it's a process, isn't it? Once you are saved, it's not just like what you've said there. Like new suit, here we go.
Yeah.
Away with the new Bible and away down the road. But it's a slow process of dealing with past issues. It's dealing with trauma. It's dealing with all these different things. But I realised through spending time with God that He is, I'm probably not going to get these words right, but omniscient, He's all-knowing, omnipotent, He's all-powerful, and a big one here, He's omnibenevolent. Omnibenevolent. He's supremely good. And I have to admit that I really struggled with these concepts due to the fact that I didn't see any good at all, only through fear, probably. I didn't see any of these attributes, if you will, in my own dad. And that his only power was displayed through violent streaks. And that terrified me. I had major problems then with seeing that that God is all-knowing, He's all-powerful, and He is ultimately good. And even just the simple word dad, it laid deep anxieties upon me. And I was so scared, I think scared is the word here, to accept God as Father. But, and the but here, when I surrendered it all to Jesus, when I opened up both hands, my deep longing was satisfied. It was satisfied. And as I say, I forgave my earthly father. I restored relationships with my family that I had ruined. I remember distinctly going to my dad's house and going to the door and knocking on the door, and I'm opening the door and walking in, and there was a couple of moments where I had said, where I was living now, I said that and I remember talking to him and almost being the cook speaking to me. I was going, hey you, I'm a believer now, I'm a Christian, and maybe you should do the same. And I remember thinking those words, but not actually saying them. Because when I went to the door, he let me in. We came in, we met his new wife, we met my half-sister, and he just immediately apologised. And I couldn't get the words out then. I couldn't get the words out to say, you need to do this, you need to do that, and I had all this plan set up that I was going to go out and perhaps maybe see my dad saved, but the words were never, they never left my mouth. So again, I forgave him. God restored those relationships. He's the bridge, He's the gap. But ultimately, the only way that I was able to completely move forward in my life was ultimately Jesus. That's the only way that I couldn't and can't now even imagine life now without Jesus in it. Because in 1998, I moved to Edinburgh. I surrendered my life to Jesus in 1999. I would not be here today if it wasn't for Jesus. I'm so grateful for the countless times that God has reminded me of where I came from and how I have changed. Because ultimately, the only way that I have changed is through His grace, through His mercy, through His loving kindness, through His invitation to enter His kingdom, through Jesus. It was through nothing else. That's the only way that I believe that people can come through those hurts, those trauma-filled pasts. It's the only way.
The bond between a parent and child should be the most positive thing in the world. And while none of us are perfect, when it works well, there's a reason we start to sound like them, isn't there? But when it's toxic, when they can't be there, or who they should be when they are there, well, the impact is all the deeper. The devastation of a shed anchor is all the stronger. But it doesn't have to be the end. The fact that our parents have let us down, or that we as parents let our children down. Doesn't have to be the end. Lives can be healed. Sometimes relationships can be restored, but even when they can't, there is one who can fill the hole, who is never absent, who is always loving, tender, compassionate, and ultimately merciful, a grace-giving Heavenly Father who never leaves us. And that is the hope and the promise we can hold out to those whose lives have been blighted by the parenthood crisis that seems to be affecting so many families at this time. James's book is called No Hope to Full of Joy. It is an inspirational account of how God can break into a life and bring transformation from hurts that are, for most of us, thankfully, unimaginable. James Goldie, lovely to speak to you today. Thank you for taking time to share your story and your thoughts and your perspective.
Thanks for having me.
You've been listening to UCB Life Issues. I'm Paul Hammond. Thank you also to Rachel, my producer for this week's episode. Why not join us next week for another Life Issues? Ta-da.